I still remember the smell of coffee that morning, bitter and sharp, like it always was in our kitchen. I had been up before sunrise, as usual, ironing my shirt, checking the bills, making sure everything was ready for the day. 40 years. 40 years I had poured my sweat and my soul into this family, and for what? My hands ached from decades of work, landscaping, fixing the roof, repairing the car, but I never complained. I thought love, loyalty, and hard work were enough. My son Marcus came in late, hair messy, eyes tired, and before I could even greet him, he said it. He didn't yell, didn't even pause. He just looked at me with that cold, calm certainty. "You did nothing for us. You're going to a nursing home." I froze, the mug slipping in my hands, coffee spilling onto the floor. I wanted to speak, to argue, to remind him of the nights I stayed awake when he was sick, the jobs I took to pay for his college, the sacrifices I made without ever asking for thanks. But the words caught in my throat. 40 years, and in one sentence, he erased everything. I sat there stunned, tasting the bitter coffee and something sharper, the taste of betrayal. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't believe that the boy I raised was the one doing this to me. I didn't leave the kitchen that day. I just sat on the chair, staring at the spilled coffee, listening to the hum of the refrigerator like it was mocking me. 40 years of mornings like this, 40 years of putting everyone else first, and now, this. Marcus walked past me without a word, grabbing his backpack, heading out the door. No glance back. I thought about my wife. God rest her soul. She would have known what to say, how to fix this without fighting, without breaking. But she was gone, and I was alone with the silence that followed my son's words. The house felt too big, too empty, and even the ticking of the clock seemed too loud. I wandered through the rooms, touching the walls I had painted, the floors I had scrubbed, the garden I had built with my own two hands, everything I had done for this family. It was like I had poured my life into sand, and it had slipped right through. The memories of laughter, birthdays, holidays, all that work, all that love, feeling like it meant nothing. And then I felt it. The first flicker of anger, sharp and cold, not just at Marcus, but at the life that had allowed this, the life that had taught me to give and give until there was nothing left. Maybe it was time I stopped giving. Maybe it was time someone finally recognized that I had a life too, one that wasn't meant to vanish into a nursing home. The house was quiet, but my mind was screaming. I found myself in the living room, sitting in my old leather chair that had molded to my shape over decades. I ran my hands along the armrests, feeling the worn leather, remembering how I had once carried Marcus here as a baby, how we had celebrated his high school graduation, the nights I stayed up, waiting for him to come home safely from parties I wasn't invited to. Every crease, every scratch, every dent in this chair told a story of a life spent for others. And now I was disposable. I tried to shake it off, tried to tell myself it was just words, that Marcus didn't mean it, but I knew better. He had meant every syllable. I had raised him to be strong, independent, ambitious, and somewhere along the way, he had decided my strength was only useful while I served him. 40 years of loyalty, work, and sacrifice, and in one sentence, it was all reduced to nothing. I wandered into the garage, flipping the light switch and watching the bulb flicker weakly. My hands lingered on the tools I had used for years: wrenches, hammers, saws, drills. These were my weapons and my comfort, things I could control when life felt like it was spinning out of control. I could fix anything: a leaky faucet, a broken fence, a sputtering engine. I could fix the world for everyone, except for myself. I leaned against the workbench, closing my eyes, letting the memories wash over me. I remembered my father, the way he had worked 2 jobs, scraping together everything he could to keep us fed and clothed, the way he'd hum softly in the kitchen while I ate my breakfast. I remembered the day he passed, the silence of the hospital room, and the hollow realization that life doesn't reward the ones who give everything. Life takes and takes, and sometimes it spits you out when you least expect it. I felt a heaviness in my chest, a weight that was more than just sadness. It was a mix of betrayal, grief, and the first sparks of anger that felt like fire. I realized then that I had a choice: to sink into this despair, let it consume me, or fight back, not in ways that would hurt Marcus, not in petty revenge, but in ways that would remind me who I was, who I had always been. I thought about the nursing home he mentioned, the life of slow decay, dependency, and invisibility. I could see myself there, a shadow in a room full of strangers, labeled the old man, with nothing left to offer. And I refused. I refused to spend the last chapters of my life waiting to be ignored, waiting for apologies that would never come. I decided then that I would rebuild. Not for Marcus, not for anyone but me. I would find a life where my efforts mattered, where my time, sweat, and experience counted. I would show, silently, that I was more than the sum of what I had given. 40 years of work had not gone to waste. It had taught me resilience, patience, and resourcefulness, and I would use every ounce of that to reclaim my dignity. I left the garage and walked to my old truck. The engine roared to life with a familiar growl, a sound that reminded me of freedom, of open roads and endless possibilities. I drove without destination, letting the city pass by in blurs of color and sound. Each mile felt like a small victory, each passing street a tiny reclaiming of myself. For the first time in decades, I felt like I was moving for me, not for anyone else. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, I realized something powerful. The world hadn't ended. My life hadn't ended. Marcus's words had stung, yes, but they hadn't broken me. I was still standing. I was still alive. And for the first time in a long time, I felt unstoppable. The next morning, I woke up with a new rhythm in my chest, a pulse of purpose that felt unfamiliar but invigorating. I could still hear Marcus's words from the day before, sharp and cutting, but now they felt like fuel instead of a curse. I was done feeling small in my own home. Today, I would begin reclaiming my life in ways that mattered. Not revenge, not drama, but real, tangible steps toward freedom. I started with my wardrobe. I dug through decades of clothes I had worn for work and family events, clothes that reminded me of obligations rather than choices. I kept a few pieces for practicality, but I boxed up the rest: shirts, jackets, shoes that no longer defined who I was. I felt lighter, not just physically, but inside. Each folded garment was like shedding an old version of myself, the man who had put everyone else first at the expense of his own life. Next, I tackled my finances. 40 years of diligent saving meant I wasn't helpless, and I began making plans for a smaller, more manageable life. I didn't want luxury. I wanted freedom. I met with my financial advisor, a careful woman named Lisa, who guided me through investments and savings I had ignored for decades while working double shifts, helping with college tuition, and fixing everything from broken sinks to broken hearts. For the first time, I understood that money wasn't just a tool for others. It was a tool for me, for independence. By midday, I was walking through the city, soaking in sights I had missed while lost in obligations. The park was full of people, children laughing as they ran past, dogs tugging at their leashes, couples holding hands. I noticed the sound of a busker strumming a guitar, the smell of pretzels from a cart nearby, the sun warm on my shoulders. Everything felt sharper, more vivid. Life had color again. Life wasn't a series of chores or sacrifices. It was this living, breathing moment I had almost forgotten how to enjoy. Then I stopped at a small bookstore, one tucked between two towering office buildings. The scent of old paper and ink wrapped around me like a warm blanket. I wandered through the aisles, running my fingers along spines of books I had never had time for. Novels, biographies, travel journals. I picked a few at random, promising myself that tonight I would read not for duty, but for pleasure, for curiosity, for the simple joy of feeding my mind. It was a small act, but it felt revolutionary. By late afternoon, I was back in my truck, driving without a destination. I stopped at a quiet overlook, watching the city stretch beneath me, the golden light of sunset brushing skyscrapers and streets alike. I thought about Marcus again, but this time without bitterness. His words had stung, yes, but they had also forced me to see a truth I had been avoiding. I had spent decades giving everything and asking nothing for myself. Now I could change that. As night fell, I returned home with the books in one hand and a notebook in the other. I sat by the window writing down ideas, plans, dreams I had buried for too long. Maybe I would travel. Maybe I would start a small business. Maybe I would volunteer, but on my terms, not just to satisfy someone else's expectations. Every word on the page was a reclaiming of power, a small but concrete step toward the life I deserved. And for the first time in years, I slept without guilt. I had started to dismantle the invisible chains of 40 years of unrecognized labor, and I realized something vital. Freedom wasn't about leaving Marcus behind. It was about moving forward with strength, clarity, and pride. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was alive, and alive in this city, in this life, meant everything. The next morning, I woke to the hum of the city and the smell of fresh rain on the streets outside. It had poured overnight, washing everything clean, and somehow the world felt different. I felt different. The weight of Marcus's words still lingered, but now it was a tool, a spark I could use to shape the life I wanted, rather than let it crush me. Today I decided I would take action beyond my comfort zone. I started with my body. Years of labor had left me strong, but I had ignored fitness for myself for too long. I went to the small gym downtown, the one I had passed countless times but never entered. The smell of sweat and rubber mats hit me immediately, but it didn't bother me. It energized me. I lifted weights I hadn't touched in years, feeling the burn in my muscles, feeling every fiber of my body come alive. Sweat dripped down my face, and with every rep, I felt myself reclaiming more than just strength. I was reclaiming confidence, autonomy, and control. After the gym, I wandered through the farmer's market. The colors were intense: crimson tomatoes, deep green kale, golden apples. The smells hit me in waves: fresh bread, herbs, roasted nuts. I picked up a few items, chatting briefly with the vendors, savoring the human connection I had overlooked while focused on obligations. I bought strawberries for no reason other than they made me smile, and a jar of local honey that smelled of warm sun and wild flowers. It felt indulgent, and that was okay. For 40 years, indulgence had been a luxury I postponed indefinitely. Today, I decided indulgence was my right. By afternoon, I was at the library, a place that had always felt like a sanctuary. I immersed myself in biographies of men who had overcome betrayal, hardship, and disappointment. Each story resonated. Each tale of resilience mirrored a fragment of my own life. I scribbled notes in my notebook, plans forming like seeds taking root. I didn't want revenge. I wanted fulfillment. I wanted a life that reflected all I had given without the expectation of repayment. I wanted proof that I could thrive even when others doubted me. That evening I drove to the edge of town, to a small lookout over the river. The water was dark and calm, reflecting the city lights in fragmented lines. I breathed deeply, the cool air filling my lungs, and I allowed myself to feel pride for the first time in years. Pride for surviving 40 years of sacrifice, pride for finally choosing me, pride for the life I was beginning to claim. I thought about Marcus again. I knew he might never understand, might never apologize. That hurt, yes, but I also realized I didn't need his validation anymore. I had built a foundation that was mine alone. I could make mistakes and learn. I could fail and recover. I could live fully without being tethered to the judgments of someone who saw me only as a tool. When I returned home that night, I cooked my first full meal for myself in years, savoring the flavors, the warmth, the quiet pride in doing something solely for me. I ate slowly, noticing the textures, the aromas, the satisfaction of nourishing myself. I realized that life didn't have to be about giving to others to matter. It could be about giving to myself, about building joy and dignity from the foundation I had laid over decades. As I settled into bed, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The betrayal still lingered like a scar, but it was no longer raw. It was a reminder, a marker of where I had been, and a guide to where I was going. I had started small, but I could see the path ahead, full of possibilities, full of life that was mine, and mine alone. And for the first time in decades, I slept with the certainty that I was no longer defined by others, but by the man I chose to be. The next morning, I woke to the sun cutting through my blinds in sharp, golden stripes. I didn't hit snooze. I didn't linger in bed thinking about Marcus. Instead, I rose, stretched, and felt the energy coursing through me, the same energy I hadn't noticed in years. Today wasn't about proving anything to him. Today was about building a life that couldn't be shaken by anyone's opinion. I decided to tackle a project I had been putting off for decades: the backyard. It was overgrown, tangled with weeds and wild grass, a visual reminder of all the years I had prioritized everyone else over myself. I started with gloves and a rusty pair of shears, pulling at vines that had crept up the fence and trimming overgrown bushes. The smell of earth and damp wood filled my nose. The sweat ran down my back, but each movement reminded me of my strength. Every root I pulled felt like reclaiming territory in my own life. By mid-morning, I was drenched, but there was a quiet satisfaction in seeing the open spaces begin to take shape. I dug a small patch for a vegetable garden. Tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. Small symbols of growth I would nurture for myself. I could taste the summer flavors already in my imagination, and for the first time, I felt a sense of accomplishment that wasn't tied to anyone else's praise. It was just mine. After lunch, I got in my truck and drove without destination, letting my instincts lead me. I found myself in a neighborhood I hadn't visited since Marcus was a boy. Streets lined with old brick houses, the scent of freshly cut grass in the air. I stopped at a small park, watching children play and couples walk dogs. A man jogged past me, nodding politely, and I nodded back. I realized something simple yet profound. Life was still happening, and I could still be part of it on my own terms. I spent the afternoon volunteering at a local community center, not because I needed approval, but because it felt right. I helped set up tables for a youth program, showing some kids how to repair bicycles. Their wide-eyed attention, their eager hands, reminded me that the world was full of opportunities to make a real impact, not for family obligations, but because it mattered to me to give back in a way that was meaningful. I laughed more in those hours than I had in months. As the sun began to set, I returned home and walked through the now tamed backyard, my hands and clothes streaked with dirt, my muscles pleasantly sore. I looked at the space I had transformed. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I felt a deep, steady pride. 40 years of giving had taught me resilience, patience, and determination. Now, I was applying those lessons to myself, not to satisfy anyone else. That night I cooked a proper dinner, savoring every bite, and spent hours reading in my favorite chair, letting the words wash over me. I thought about Marcus, yes, but without anger. He had revealed a truth I had resisted for too long. My life had been shaped by everyone else's needs. That was no longer the case. I could live fully, boldly, unapologetically. Before sleep, I stepped onto the porch and looked at the stars. Quiet, infinite, unwavering. They reminded me that life was vast and full of possibilities, and I realized, for the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone else's validation. I was the architect of my own life. I was free. The next morning, I woke to the soft hum of the city waking up, the distant sound of car engines, and the faint aroma of breakfast from a neighbor's kitchen. I felt restless, not in a panicked way, but in a way that pushed me forward. I realized I couldn't just reclaim my life piece by piece. I had to step into it fully. I had to make choices that would define the next chapter of me, not the next chapter of Marcus or anyone else. I started with my truck, giving it a thorough cleaning inside and out. Dusty seats, fingerprints, crumbs from years of rushed meals, all gone. I polished the dashboard until it gleamed, ran my hands along the steering wheel, and felt a small surge of pride. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was my mobility, my independence, a tool that could carry me anywhere I wanted to go, unbound by anyone's expectation. By mid-morning, I decided to take a short trip out of the city. I drove to the countryside, the cityscape giving way to rolling hills and open fields. The air smelled different there, fresher, crisper, with hints of pine and damp soil. I stopped by a small lake, the water calm and reflective, like a mirror for my thoughts. I sat on a worn bench, listening to the gentle lapping of the water and the distant call of birds, feeling something I hadn't felt in years: peace. As I watched the sunlight shimmer across the lake, I thought about all the times I had sacrificed for Marcus, for family, for work. I didn't regret the love I had given or the effort I had poured in, but I finally understood something vital. Love doesn't have to be transactional, and effort doesn't have to be invisible. I could honor my own labor, my own commitment, by living a life that reflected the value I had always carried inside me. I drove back to the city as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in purples and golds. On the way, I stopped at a small cafe I had passed countless times but never entered. The aroma of roasted coffee beans and warm pastries filled the air, inviting me in. I ordered a cappuccino and a slice of cheesecake, something decadent, something for myself, and sat by the window watching the world move outside. Cars, pedestrians, streetlights flickering on. I realized that for the first time, I was living without the weight of obligation pressing me down. Every choice was mine. Every moment was mine. That evening I returned home and began writing letters. Not to Marcus, not to anyone else, but to myself. Letters of affirmation, of acknowledgement for the life I had built, the hardships I had survived, and the courage I was discovering within myself. I wrote about my dreams, my fears, my victories, no matter how small. Each word was a reclaiming of my narrative, a reminder that my story was mine to tell, not anyone else's to judge. As night fell, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the cool air brushing against my face. I looked at the city lights stretching into the distance, a web of lives intertwined, each with their struggles, triumphs, and secrets. And I realized I was no longer defined by Marcus's words, or by the sacrifices he failed to see. I was defined by my resilience, my choices, and my courage to step into the life I deserved. For the first time in decades, I felt the quiet satisfaction of autonomy. My life wasn't over. It wasn't diminished. And tomorrow, I would take another step forward, building on the independence I had started to claim. I was free, I was alive, and I was ready for whatever came next. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, the city still wrapped in a soft gray quiet. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't check the news or messages. For once, I wanted the day to come without noise, without obligation, without anyone telling me who I was or what I should do. I slipped into my clothes, feeling the fabric against my skin, and noticed something I hadn't in years. I was awake, alive, and fully present. I started with breakfast, making myself something that felt indulgent but simple: eggs cooked in butter, toast with jam, fresh squeezed orange juice. I took the time to notice the textures, the aromas, the warmth rising from the plate. Each bite reminded me that life didn't have to be about surviving. It could be about enjoying the small things, savoring the quiet victories that had been overlooked while I spent decades giving everything to others. For the first time in years, I ate entirely for myself, with no guilt attached. After breakfast, I walked through the city streets, noticing details I had long ignored: the sound of a dog barking in an alley, the laughter of children chasing pigeons, the smell of fresh paint from a mural someone had just finished. Each sensory detail grounded me, reminded me I was alive, and reminded me that I had the right to experience life fully on my own terms. The rhythm of the city matched the rhythm in my chest, a steady beat of independence, determination, and reclamation. I decided to take the next step in reclaiming my life, reconnecting with passions I had abandoned. I stopped at a music store, running my fingers over the keyboards and guitars, remembering the music lessons I had taken as a young man but never pursued seriously. I bought a guitar, not for anyone else, not to impress or teach, but for me. The first chords were clumsy, out of tune, but each note resonated in my chest. It was a reminder that it was never too late to rediscover joy, to reclaim a part of myself I had set aside for decades. By afternoon, I drove out of the city, heading toward the mountains. The air changed gradually as I left traffic behind. Crisper, cleaner, filled with the scent of pine and wet earth. I pulled over at a trailhead and began a hike I had avoided for years, telling myself I was too busy, too tired, too responsible for everyone else. My boots crunched on the dirt path, my lungs filled with cold, fresh air, and with every step I felt layers of fatigue, resentment, and neglect peeling off. The sweat on my skin was more than physical. It was symbolic. I was burning away years of invisibility and reclaiming the sense of purpose I had almost forgotten. Halfway up the trail, I paused on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley below. Fog lingered over the river that cut through the land like a silver ribbon, and I realized I could see for miles. Everything in perspective. In that moment I thought of Marcus again. I felt the sting, sure, but I also felt clarity. He would never fully understand the sacrifices I made, the nights I stayed awake worrying, the hours I spent building a life for him and this family. And that was fine. I didn't need his understanding. I didn't need his approval. I needed only myself. And now, for the first time, I had that fully. I began the descent as the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the mountains in gold and crimson. My muscles ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that reminds you you are alive and capable. I felt a pride that had nothing to do with anyone else, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that I was finally living for myself. 40 years of devotion, of sacrifice, had taught me resilience, patience, and perseverance. Now, I was applying those lessons to my own life, building a foundation that was unshakable, because it was mine alone. When I returned home, the city lights twinkled in the distance like stars brought down to earth. I cooked myself a meal, the smell of garlic and onions filling the kitchen, the sound of sizzling oil a comforting rhythm. I ate slowly, deliberately, savoring the textures, flavors, and warmth. I realized that I had been hungry, not for food but for autonomy, for recognition, for life that belonged to me. And tonight, for the first time in decades, I was full in a way that went beyond the stomach. After dinner, I sat in my chair with the guitar across my knees. The first few chords were off-key, clumsy, but I persisted, letting the sound fill the room, letting it echo through the empty spaces that once felt lonely. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't for anyone to see or judge. It was a ritual of reclaiming, of reminding myself that I had value, creativity, and joy that didn't require validation from anyone, least of all Marcus. Before sleep, I stepped onto the porch and watched the city below. The hum of traffic, the faint laughter from a bar down the street, the soft glow of streetlights. It all reminded me that life went on relentlessly, for everyone and for no one at the same time. I realized that I didn't need to wait for someone else's recognition to feel whole. I didn't need Marcus's apology or gratitude to validate my existence. I had spent decades giving my life away, and now I was taking it back, one deliberate, unapologetic choice at a time. That night, I slept with a sense of completeness I hadn't known in years. I was no longer defined by betrayal or neglect. I was defined by resilience, courage, and the quiet power of a life reclaimed. I knew there would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt, and perhaps encounters with Marcus that would test my resolve. But I also knew something else. I was no longer fragile. I was no longer invisible. I was awake, alive, and finally, undeniably mine. The morning light poured through the blinds, cutting sharp lines across my bedroom floor. I didn't linger under the covers today. Instead, I rose and moved with purpose, feeling the pulse of independence I had been nurturing over the last few weeks. Life had been a long series of compromises and sacrifices, and for 40 years, I had given everything to others. Now every step I took was for me, and it felt intoxicating. I started my day with a walk through the neighborhood. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew on grass and the subtle aroma of fresh coffee from nearby cafes. I nodded at familiar faces, exchanged polite greetings, and for the first time, I felt entirely unburdened by obligations. No one owed me anything, but neither did I owe anyone my life. It was mine, fully and unapologetically. By mid-morning, I had made my way to the city library. The quiet hum of air conditioning, the subtle smell of aging books, and the soft rustle of pages created a cocoon of focus and reflection. I had brought my notebook, determined to map out the life I wanted rather than drifting in the currents of obligation. I scribbled ideas, small goals, big dreams, a modest apartment downtown, a road trip I had always postponed, classes I had wanted to take, even a chance to volunteer in ways that resonated with me personally. Each line on the page was a reclaiming of autonomy, a promise to myself that I would no longer defer my happiness to others' expectations. After the library, I wandered into a local coffee shop I had never noticed before. The smell of roasted beans, sweet pastries, and the quiet murmur of conversation enveloped me. I ordered a cappuccino and a croissant, and as I sat by the window I noticed how alive the city felt when you truly paused to observe it. Children on their way to school, couples holding hands, commuters rushing past. Life was a web of moments, each one fleeting and precious, and I realized I had been missing all of it while living under the weight of servitude. Feeling inspired, I drove out to a small art gallery downtown. I had never been particularly cultured, as Marcus would say, but today curiosity guided me. The smell of oil paint, the soft echo of footsteps on hardwood, the colors and textures of paintings lining the walls, they stirred something inside me I had ignored for years. I spent hours moving from one piece to another, absorbing the emotion, the story, the painstaking effort behind every brushstroke. It struck me that my own life could be approached the same way, intentional, expressive, and mine to craft. By late afternoon I decided to take my truck and drive along the riverfront. The water glimmered under the low sun, a long ribbon of silver stretching through the city. I parked and walked along the bank, feeling the cool wind on my face, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, the faint scent of river mud mixing with the freshness of the evening air. I reflected on Marcus again, but now with a sense of clarity instead of anger. His rejection was a catalyst, not a verdict. I could choose the narrative of my life from this point forward. I could transform disappointment into action, betrayal into self-assertion. As night fell, I returned home and cooked myself a proper meal, the sizzling sounds of onions and garlic filling the kitchen. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, each aroma, each texture. For the first time, I wasn't rushing to prepare or serve anyone else. This was for me. I realized that 40 years of giving had taught me discipline, resilience, and patience. Those lessons, once devoted entirely to others, were now mine to apply to myself. I could work toward a life that honored me without feeling guilty for it. After dinner, I picked up my guitar again. The first few chords were clumsy, out of tune, but I persisted. Music had always been a distant memory, something I postponed for obligations. Now, each note echoed through the room like a declaration. I existed for myself. I strummed slowly, letting the vibration fill me, letting it remind me that creativity, joy, and purpose were not dependent on anyone else's validation. Before sleep, I stepped onto the porch and looked at the city lights shimmering in the distance. The faint sounds of distant traffic and laughter mingled with the cool night air. I felt a quiet pride that had nothing to do with Marcus, nothing to do with family, and everything to do with reclaiming myself. I had survived decades of giving without recognition, and now I was thriving because I chose to. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer defined by betrayal. I was alive, autonomous, and free. Tomorrow, I decided, I would take the next step. Not for anyone else, not for gratitude or acknowledgement, but for the life I had been missing for too long. For the first time in decades, I felt fully awake, fully capable, and entirely in control. And that, I realized, was more powerful than any apology could ever be. I woke that morning to the sound of distant traffic and the faint scent of rain still lingering in the air. The world felt alive, and for the first time in decades, I felt like I belonged in it. Not as someone who existed to serve, but as someone who lived deliberately. The sting of Marcus's words was still there, a dull ache under the surface, but it no longer dictated my mood or my choices. Instead, it had become a guidepost, reminding me that I had waited too long to live for myself. I started the day by revisiting the backyard, the small patch of land I had begun reclaiming weeks ago. The garden I had planted was thriving, tomatoes beginning to ripen, herbs releasing pungent, earthy scents, and peppers bright against the green. I knelt in the soil, feeling it crumble beneath my fingers, the sun warming my back. This patch of earth was mine, and every leaf, every stem, every tiny bloom was a testament to patience, labor, and resilience. For 40 years, I had given to others. Now, I gave to myself. After a long morning of work in the garden, I hopped in my truck and headed to the local community center. I had volunteered before, but today I wanted to engage more meaningfully. I helped a group of teenagers repair bicycles, showing them how to adjust brakes, fix chains, and maintain tires. They listened intently, their curiosity bright in their eyes, and I realized that mentoring them wasn't about ego. It was about passing on knowledge, experience, and encouragement. For the first time, I was giving without resentment, without expectation. It was joyful, purposeful, and entirely mine to choose. After the session, I drove to the library to check out books on woodworking. I had always admired craftsmanship, the ability to create something tangible, useful, and beautiful from raw materials. The smell of old wood and the crisp pages of books drew me in, and I felt that familiar spark of curiosity that had lain dormant for decades. I checked out a couple of manuals and sketches, determined to start a project I had put off for years. A small wooden bench for the backyard. The thought of creating something with my hands, for myself, filled me with quiet excitement. By mid-afternoon, I found myself at a small coffee shop I had discovered weeks ago. I ordered a latte and a slice of pecan pie, sitting by the window and watching the city move around me. Cars passed, pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks. A street musician played a soft melody nearby. The world was alive, and for once, I felt fully in sync with it. I took out my notebook and sketched ideas for future projects, jotting down places I wanted to visit and experiences I wanted to have. Each word, each line, felt like reclaiming time I had lost to obligation, to sacrifice, to unacknowledged labor. The drive home in the late afternoon was quiet, the city bathed in golden light. I stopped by a small overlook and watched the river, shimmering like molten silver in the sun. I breathed deeply, the cool wind brushing my face, and felt a sense of liberation I hadn't known I could feel. 40 years of giving had taught me endurance, patience, and strength. Now I applied those lessons for myself, carving out a life where my choices and my happiness mattered most. That evening I began working on the wooden bench. I measured, cut, and sanded, the smell of pine filling the air. Each stroke of the plane, each tap of the hammer, was meditative. Sweat dripped from my brow, but it was a satisfying kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes from creating something real, tangible, and wholly your own. The bench would sit in the garden I had nurtured, a symbol of reclaiming space, autonomy, and dignity. After finishing the bench, I cooked myself dinner, savoring the aroma and the warmth of the food. I ate slowly, letting each bite remind me that life could be enjoyable, deliberate, and nourishing. I didn't need Marcus's approval, his gratitude, or his recognition. I was building a life that mattered on my terms, and for the first time, the word home felt like it truly belonged to me, not just a space where I had served. Before sleep, I stepped onto the porch, guitar in hand. I played softly, letting the notes echo into the night, filling the house with sound and solitude that felt comforting rather than lonely. I realized that this journey wasn't about punishment or proving anything to Marcus. It was about reclaiming decades of my life that I had sacrificed without question. I had learned that independence, purpose, and joy didn't require permission. They required courage. As I lay down that night, I felt an unfamiliar but welcome sense of completeness. I wasn't defined by betrayal or neglect. I wasn't diminished by unacknowledged labor. I was defined by resilience, choice, and the deliberate creation of a life that reflected the man I had always been, beneath the weight of obligation. Tomorrow, I decided, would be another step forward, another act of reclamation. And for the first time, I felt ready for whatever that day might bring. I woke that morning to the soft golden light of early fall filtering through the blinds. The air carried the crisp scent of leaves beginning to turn, a subtle reminder that change was everywhere, whether I embraced it or not, and I decided I would. 40 years of sacrifice, of work for others, had brought me here, to this moment where life's possibilities stretched ahead like an open road. Today I was determined to step further into them. I started with my backyard. The bench I had built the night before sat sturdy and proud, surrounded by the small vegetable garden I had nurtured over weeks. I knelt beside it, checking the soil, touching the stems of the tomatoes and peppers, inhaling the earthy fragrance of plants growing under my care. This space had once been overgrown, tangled with weeds, a symbol of neglect. Now, it was alive, tended by my hands, a testament to persistence and reclamation. I ran my fingers along the smooth wood of the bench, feeling its weight and solidity, and realized that creating something enduring, something that belonged to me, was more satisfying than I had imagined. After a breakfast of scrambled eggs and freshly brewed coffee, I drove into town with no set destination, only the intention of exploring. I found myself wandering down streets I had passed countless times without really noticing. The city hummed around me, the distant honk of car horns, the chatter of pedestrians, the faint clatter of a streetcar. Each sound felt sharper, each scent more vivid. I stopped at a small florist and inhaled the fragrance of freshly cut flowers, letting it remind me that beauty existed even in ordinary corners, waiting to be noticed. I spent the morning in a second-hand bookstore, running my hands along the spines of worn novels and travel memoirs. I picked up a leather-bound journal and flipped through the pages, imagining myself filling it with plans, thoughts, and reflections. Writing had always been a private sanctuary, a place I rarely allowed myself to dwell. Now I would use it to map my life, not a life dictated by family expectations or obligations, but a life I chose deliberately. By early afternoon, I drove out of the city to a small lake I had discovered weeks ago. The water was glassy, reflecting the sky in streaks of gold and blue. I parked my truck, walked to the shore, and let the breeze carry away the lingering tension from years of self-denial. I threw a few pebbles into the water, listening to the soft plunk as they hit the surface, watching the ripples spread outward. It struck me that, like the water, life could ripple in unexpected ways. The impact of my choices could spread further than I imagined. Choices made for myself, not for approval or validation, had consequences, yes, but they were consequences I would own proudly. On the way back home, I stopped at a small cafe by the river and ordered a latte with a slice of pie. I sat outside, feeling the sun on my face and the cool breeze brushing my neck. The world moved around me, but I moved intentionally within it. I noticed a young man struggling with a bicycle chain nearby, and without thinking, I walked over and offered a hand. Within minutes, it was fixed. He thanked me, and I smiled, realizing that this, helping someone without expectation, giving without self-erasure, was a joy I had forgotten. It was a reminder that generosity could coexist with self-respect. By evening, I returned home, my body tired but my spirit energized. I cooked myself a proper dinner, enjoying the process of chopping, stirring, and seasoning. The kitchen smelled of roasted garlic, onions, and herbs from my garden. I sat down to eat, tasting every bite, feeling gratitude not for anyone else, but for the simple pleasure of nourishment, effort, and choice. 40 years of labor had honed me into someone resilient, and now I applied that resilience not for duty, but for the pleasure of living fully. After dinner, I sat on the porch with my guitar, letting the strings vibrate under my fingers. Music filled the air, a private symphony of reclaiming and renewal. The night was quiet, punctuated only by distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. I realized that life had not diminished me. The years of giving had strengthened me. Betrayal, neglect, and ingratitude had stung, yes, but they had also forced me to discover a power within myself I might never have recognized otherwise. Before sleep, I looked out over the city from my porch. Lights twinkled like scattered stars, and in that quiet, I understood the truth I had been avoiding for decades. Independence, joy, and purpose weren't things anyone could grant me. They had to be claimed, fought for, and nurtured. And now, I was doing just that. I was no longer the man who spent 40 years serving others at the expense of himself. I was the man who had learned to live, fully and unapologetically, for himself. And that realization, quiet but profound, filled me with a satisfaction that no words, no insults, no betrayals could ever diminish. The next morning, I woke to the sharp call of birds outside my window, their voices weaving through the quiet of my home. I stretched, feeling the lingering ache in my shoulders and knees from the week's work in the garden and the hikes. But it was a satisfying kind of ache, the kind that reminded me I was alive, capable, and finally living for myself. 40 years of labor had left its mark, but it had also left me with strength and resilience I was only now learning to wield for my own benefit. I decided to start the day with a long walk downtown. The streets were alive with morning energy, the distant hiss of buses, the clatter of shoes on pavement, the faint smell of coffee and baked goods from cafes. I observed it all deliberately, drinking in the life that pulsed around me. I greeted a shopkeeper I had passed countless times but never spoken to. He smiled, and I felt the warmth of connection. Not obligation, not duty, but simple recognition of presence. For years I had existed in the background, invisible in my own life. Today I was a participant. After my walk, I visited a local workshop that offered classes in woodworking and metalwork. I had always admired craftsmanship, but I had never taken the time to pursue it seriously. Today, I signed up. I spent hours learning to shape wood, sanding and carving pieces under the guidance of an instructor. The smell of sawdust filled the room, mingling with the faint scent of oil and varnish. The work was demanding, precise, and rewarding. I felt my hands remembering muscles I had rarely used, the rhythm of labor grounding me in the moment. This was my life, and I was crafting it with deliberate intention. By mid-afternoon, I decided to stop at a small cafe for lunch. I ordered a hearty sandwich and a latte, sitting by the window to watch the world move outside. A young couple walked past, laughing and holding hands. Children chased each other along the sidewalk. I noticed details I had overlooked for decades. The way sunlight bounced off a puddle, the scent of autumn leaves in the air, the warmth of a stranger's smile. Life was rich, textured, and alive, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel a quiet joy in simply observing it. Returning home, I spent time in my backyard garden. The tomatoes were nearly ripe, the peppers had grown bold in color, and the herbs released a fragrance that filled the air. I harvested a few ripe tomatoes and placed them carefully on the counter, admiring the fruits of my labor. 40 years of work had gone into creating a life for others, but now I was harvesting for myself, and it felt like a small victory with enormous significance. As evening approached, I took out my guitar again. The first chords were clumsy, but I persisted, letting the vibrations fill the room and echo into the night. Music had always been a distant joy, something I postponed for obligations and duties. Now, every strum was a declaration. I existed for myself. I could create, explore, and enjoy without expectation, without judgment. The melodies carried away the residue of anger and disappointment, leaving only focus, pride, and quiet exhilaration. That night, I cooked a simple but satisfying dinner, tasting each flavor, savoring each bite. I drank a glass of wine, feeling warmth spread through my chest, a comfort earned through labor, reflection, and the deliberate crafting of my life. I stepped onto the porch afterward, listening to the city's nocturnal hum, the distant sirens, the faint music from a bar, the rustle of leaves in the wind. I realized that the city itself felt alive, vibrant, and full of possibility, just like I did now. Before sleep, I opened my notebook and wrote down reflections from the day. The joy of creation, the fulfillment of independence, the power of reclaiming a life long deferred. Marcus's words still lingered, but they no longer held power over me. They had lit a fire, yes, but it was a fire I controlled. I had learned that resilience, autonomy, and the right to happiness were not given. They were claimed, and in claiming them, I had discovered a freedom that no one could take away. That night, I slept with a sense of completeness I had never known. I was no longer defined by betrayal or neglect. I was defined by my choices, my creativity, and the deliberate pursuit of a life that was mine alone. Tomorrow I would continue this journey, moving further into independence, joy, and self-respect. And for the first time in decades, I felt entirely ready. I woke that morning to a pale light slipping through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. I stretched, feeling the familiar aches from weeks of labor, hikes, and woodworking projects. But they didn't feel like burdens. They felt like proof that I had lived, moved, and taken ownership of my life. 40 years of giving had taught me endurance, patience, and strength, and now I applied those lessons entirely for myself. I decided to take a long drive outside the city. The sky was clear, the air crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. I turned onto a winding road that led toward the hills, the world opening before me. The truck's engine hummed steadily, and I felt a calm excitement, a sense of freedom that I hadn't experienced in decades. For 40 years, my life had been mapped by obligations and sacrifice. Now, I was charting my own course. I stopped at a small overlook, the hills stretching in endless waves, dotted with trees in hues of amber, crimson, and gold. The wind brushed against my face, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. I breathed deeply, letting the cold air fill my lungs, and realized how long it had been since I had allowed myself to feel truly alive. Marcus's words still echoed faintly in my mind, but they no longer cut. They were reminders of why I had to claim my life, why I could no longer defer my happiness to others. I wandered along a trail near the overlook, the gravel crunching under my boots, the smell of damp earth strong and grounding. Birds called to one another in the distance. The wind rustled through the trees, and I noticed the subtle details I had long ignored, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, the faint rustle of small animals moving in the brush, the distant sound of running water. Each detail reminded me that life was rich, textured, and full of moments I had been too busy to notice while serving everyone else. By mid-afternoon, I stopped at a small cafe tucked along the roadside. I ordered coffee and a slice of apple pie, sitting by the window to watch the world go by. The sunlight streamed through the glass, warming my shoulders. Couples strolled past, children ran with laughter spilling behind them, and the air was filled with the scent of baked goods and fresh coffee. I wrote in my notebook, recording ideas for future projects, dreams I had postponed, and reflections on independence. Every word was a reclaiming of time and energy I had given away for decades. Driving back into the city as the sun dipped lower, I felt a quiet thrill in my chest. I realized that for the first time, I was moving through the world entirely on my own terms. The cityscape, which had once felt confining, now looked full of opportunity. Every street, every intersection, every neighborhood held possibilities for new experiences, new projects, and new connections. I wasn't running from the past. I was building a future. Back home, I spent the evening tending to my garden. The tomatoes and peppers were thriving, the herbs releasing their familiar fragrance into the cool air. I harvested a few ripe vegetables and carried them inside, savoring the simple satisfaction of work well done. I realized that reclaiming my life wasn't just about leaving Marcus's judgment behind. It was about creating tangible, deliberate actions that reflected my autonomy, my joy, and my purpose. Afterward, I cooked myself a hearty dinner and sat on the porch with my guitar. The first chords rang out clumsily, but I persisted, letting the sound echo through the quiet night. Music had always been a distant joy, postponed by obligation and self-sacrifice. Now, each note was a declaration. I existed for myself. I created for myself, and I found fulfillment in the simple act of living deliberately. Before sleep, I stepped onto the porch one last time, breathing in the night air. The city lights twinkled below, and the cool breeze carried a sense of possibility. I reflected on how far I had come, from the shock of betrayal, from the sting of rejection, to this moment where I felt fully alive and fully in control. I understood that life wasn't about recognition from others. It was about claiming your own path, honoring your own efforts, and living with intention. I went to bed that night with a sense of quiet power. I was no longer defined by neglect, betrayal, or unmet expectations. I was defined by my choices, my resilience, and the life I was actively building for myself. Tomorrow would bring new steps, new projects, and new experiences, but I felt ready for them, fully awake, fully present, and fully alive. I woke that morning to the muted glow of dawn spilling across my bedroom floor. The quiet hum of the city beyond my window felt different now, less oppressive, more alive, full of possibility. I had been building this life for weeks, step by step, reclaiming space, time, and self-worth that had been buried under decades of sacrifice. And today, I felt an urgency I hadn't felt before. It was time to expand this reclamation beyond my home, to stake a claim in the world outside my comfort zone. I began the day with a long walk through the city streets. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain on asphalt, mingling with the aroma of fresh-baked bread from a nearby bakery. I noticed small details that had long escaped me: the way sunlight glanced off windows, the rhythm of footsteps on the sidewalk, the quiet exchanges of strangers passing by. I smiled at a man walking his dog, exchanged a nod with a barista on his way to the cafe, and felt a sense of belonging that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. For the first time, I realized that I could occupy space in the world without guilt, without explanation, simply by existing deliberately. By mid-morning, I found myself at a local woodworking supply shop. The smell of pine, varnish, and sawdust filled the air, a reminder of the bench I had built weeks ago, and the satisfaction of creating something with my own hands. I purchased wood, clamps, and tools for a larger project I had been envisioning: a sturdy bookcase for the living room. For years, I had put my desires aside for others. Now I was investing in myself. The thought of constructing something tangible, functional, and lasting excited me in a way I hadn't anticipated. Back home, I spent hours in the workshop cutting, sanding, and assembling. My hands were raw, my muscles sore, but every strike of the hammer and stroke of the plane reinforced a truth I was internalizing more each day. I had agency over my life, and I was capable of shaping it intentionally. The scent of fresh wood, the sound of tools, and the rhythmic repetition of work grounded me, connecting me to decades of experience and resilience I had accumulated. Every piece of the bookcase was a testament to endurance, patience, and self-determination. By late afternoon, I took a break and wandered into a nearby park. Children laughed as they played on swings, joggers ran past in steady rhythm, and the faint scent of wet grass and autumn leaves filled the air. I found a quiet bench and reflected on my journey. Marcus's words had once felt like a judgment I could not escape, a condemnation of my life's work. But now I saw them differently. They had sparked the very fire that was reshaping me. What had once been a wound had become fuel, pushing me toward a life defined not by obligation, but by intention. That evening, I returned home with the bookcase completed. I placed it in the living room, lining it with books, journals, and personal mementos. The sight of it, solid and functional, filled me with pride. I had created something lasting, something that belonged entirely to me, and in doing so, I felt a satisfaction that no words, no insults, and no betrayal could diminish. For 40 years, I had given everything to others. Now, I was learning the quiet joy of giving to myself. Dinner was simple but deliberate: roasted vegetables, a piece of fresh bread, a glass of wine. I ate slowly, savoring each flavor, appreciating the effort and choice that went into this moment. Later, I sat on the porch with my guitar, letting the first tentative chords fill the night. The music echoed into the quiet darkness, a soundtrack to the reclamation of my life. Every note reminded me that independence, creativity, and joy were within reach, and that I was entitled to them simply because I existed. Before sleep, I reflected on how far I had come, from the initial sting of betrayal to the active reconstruction of my life. The path had been painful, but each step had brought me closer to a man I recognized: resilient, deliberate, and alive. I knew tomorrow would hold new challenges, new opportunities, and new ways to assert myself in the world. But for the first time in decades, I felt ready to meet them head-on, unburdened by guilt, fully present, and fully committed to living a life that was truly mine. I woke that morning with the sun spilling warm light across the floor, filling the room with a quiet optimism I hadn't felt in decades. Today felt different, not because anything external had changed, but because I had changed. 40 years of labor, sacrifice, and invisible toil had led me here, to a place where I was finally living for myself. The sting of Marcus's words had faded, replaced by clarity. My life was mine to shape, and I had proven to myself that I could do it. I began the day in my backyard, tending the garden I had built from scratch. The tomatoes were plump, the herbs released their familiar earthy scent, and the small wooden bench I had crafted weeks ago gleamed in the sunlight. I knelt in the soil, letting the texture and smell ground me, feeling each plant as a testament to patience and care. Every moment of sweat, every careful act of tending, reminded me that the life I had poured into others could now flourish for me. It was a quiet victory, but it resonated louder than any words could. By mid-morning, I decided to take a drive along the riverfront, the water glittering under the sun like molten silver. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and damp earth. I parked and walked along the path, feeling the gravel under my boots, the wind brushing against my face. Families played nearby, couples strolled hand in hand, and joggers moved rhythmically past me. Each life passing by felt vibrant, full of possibility, and I realized I was part of it, not as an invisible observer, but as a man fully present, fully alive. At a small cafe along the way, I ordered coffee and a slice of pie, sitting by the window to watch the world unfold. I noticed the tiny details that had always escaped me, the way sunlight danced across a puddle, the laughter of a child chasing a dog, the subtle interaction of strangers sharing a moment. Each detail reminded me that life was not about grand gestures or recognition. It was about noticing, experiencing, and choosing to exist fully. For 40 years, I had existed to serve others. Now I existed to savor life itself. Returning home, I worked on a larger woodworking project I had envisioned weeks ago, a sturdy bookshelf to hold my growing collection of books, journals, and mementos. The smell of fresh-cut wood, the rhythmic sound of hammer against nail, and the focused precision of my hands grounded me in the present. With each completed section, I felt a quiet pride swelling inside me, a pride that had nothing to do with Marcus or anyone else, a pride that belonged entirely to me. As evening approached, I sat on the porch with my guitar, strumming softly while the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting the sky in shades of amber and purple. The music filled the air, a private symphony that celebrated resilience, independence, and life reclaimed. I thought about Marcus one last time, not with anger or bitterness, but with understanding. His words had stung, but they had led me to this point. They had forced me to see that my worth was not measured by others' recognition, but by my ability to honor myself, take action, and live deliberately. Dinner was simple but satisfying, a meal prepared entirely for myself. I ate slowly, savoring the flavors, the textures, and the quiet satisfaction of self-sufficiency. 40 years of service had honed my strength, endurance, and patience. Now, I applied all of it to the creation of a life that reflected my choices, desires, and independence. The taste of roasted vegetables and fresh bread was sweetened by the knowledge that every action, every decision, was mine. Before sleep, I stepped onto the porch one last time, looking at the city lights twinkling below, a mirror of the stars above. The distant hum of life, the faint sounds of cars, laughter, and music, was no longer background noise. It was a symphony of possibility, reminding me that I had the power to shape my days, create joy, and claim my life without apology. I went to bed that night fully at peace, fully alive, and fully myself. Marcus's rejection had once seemed unbearable, but now it was a distant echo, replaced by certainty. I was resilient, I was capable, and I had reclaimed what was always mine. Life wasn't about waiting for recognition, gratitude, or validation. It was about taking action, embracing autonomy, and living with intention. And at last, I could say, without doubt, I am free.